So, first of all, thank you to Möwe. I know from my own experience how much work it is to organize a lecture series. And it's not financially remunerated or anything, but it's really rewarding anyway. So thank you very much. And yeah, to all the audience, thank you for being here. Thank you for your interest. Yeah, tonight I would like to introduce you to one of the theory debates on the systems of economics. And for Möwe, it's quite self-evident that pluralism and diversity in economics is something good, but in the broad debate, this is still disputed. And so I would like to make a short introduction to this debate and to the answer of how standards of science, of scientific conduct are set in economics. And here is the little overview, not only give you an introduction about why we talk about pluralism in economics today, but also provide somehow a type of orientation, what we are talking about when we are talking about pluralism. So we can enable ourselves to decide if we want pluralism as a system of economics, or if we want monism or a different system, so we can get creative and emancipate ourselves in the discussion. And I will present the two narratives which are at stake here, the monist narrative, which we know from mainstream economics, and the pluralist narrative on how to design and pursue economics as a science. Last but not least, I would like to end on a pragmatic and maybe uplifting note and ask the question how we can transform and diversify economics. This lecture series is one example of that. But I would like to make some more meta points on setting new standards in economics. So why are we still talking? Why are we talking about pluralism in economics today? Because of student activism. I really would like us to appreciate that, because it is a lot of work. It's, in my point of view, not self-evident that students think of their education, their study program as something that they should transform, that they should be actively taking part in and redesign, redefine, and fight for something different. When I entered the university in Bayreuth, for me, studying the study program was all set, and I was little me inside, and the institutional and conceptual framework was really not to be changed. And this is this is a mind shift that these study groups actually and student initiatives have done, from accepting the institutional framework as given and changing and transforming them. So I won't indulge in the history of those initiatives, since you have already done that, but you can see it's an international movement far beyond Germany. And it's growing, actually. So let me come to the main reason why we talk about pluralism, why we talk about pluralism in economics today. It's because of the real world and its problems. There are 2 points with this, actually. On the one hand side, I think we can agree that the real world, or reality, it's a difficult concept. Our life worlds are complex in nature. They are complex, they're heterogeneous, they're diverse, they're plural. So we have pluralism or plurality and diversity as one of the characteristics of the life world we are living in, we are performing every day, and which we want to study as scientists. On the other hand, why we discuss pluralism in economics is actually because there's a gap between what is taught and thought in economics and real world problems. I was talking about the student initiatives, and there's actually the experience of a manifold dissonance between what they experience in the classroom in economics and what they're experiencing in their daily lives. We've seen that with your answers in the Mentimeter, why you're motivated to study economics or to visit this lecture series. Most of the motivations come from the real world. And as economists from the Cusanus University have actually shown in a recent empirical study, is that economic students experience a threefold gap, a threefold dissonance between the real world and its complexity and the simplicity of economics. It's a practical gap, it's a moral gap, and it's an epistemic gap. and the epistemic gap, all three are actually reasons or motivations to fight for pluralism. But it's the epistemic gap that you cannot translate the economic truth or make a meaningful translation from the economic truth to your life world, which are actually the most common reasons why to engage for pluralism in economic science. So these are the two reasons we need to talk about pluralism, and we are still talking about pluralism in economics today. But of course, there's a third reason missing, and that's economics itself. We talk about pluralism in economics because, first of all, why economics? Economics matters. Most of your little quotes in the Mentimeter already talked about that. You want to become an expert in a talk show, or you want to create a better world. And that's why you discuss want to study economics. Also because I think someone wrote it's part of politics. So that's one of the reasons why it is important to talk about economics as a science, because it has a great performative impact. Scholars of economics become policy experts, they can become politicians and sit in advisory boards and shape public opinion. This, first of all, is the reason why we should talk about it anyway. The second reason is why talk about pluralism in economics, because it's absent. It's obviously absent, and there are two levels on which it is absent. The first is here represented by the four major textbooks in economics. It's absent on its theoretical level, and then, as we have already seen in the introduction of Leonie, there's also an institutional side to this science, which is the people who perform it. The people who are asked, they are not depicted here, but the people who perform it here represented by the latest recipients of the so-called Nobel Prize in economics. You see most of them are male, most of them are men, most of them are white, most of them come from countries of the global north. So we have two levels of monism or homogeneity in economics, and or to have it the other way, pluralism is absent. And I want to give you some numbers on that. And since we are in Germany right now still, although we are speaking English, I allowed myself to give you some numbers from an empirical study, which I like very much because it was a full evaluation of all professors in economics, 708, which was studied in Austria, Switzerland, and Germany. And they looked at their CVs, association websites, journal publications. So you have a really good database. And just to give you a short insight here, most of them do microeconomic research. Only a few, 14%, are doing research on the financial crisis. This was the topic of the research. And then we have the two points that interest us here. It's really a rough sketch, I know, but we don't want to use too much of your time. We have a strong dominance of the so-called neoclassical mainstream. I won't get into the categorization battle because it's so hard to categorize what's neoclassic, what's mainstream, what's side stream, what's heterodox, what orthodox. I hope you come with me with all those terms. Mainstream, and this is what I will use, mainstream or standard economics is what is considered standard economic theory. And it's actually a blend of some parts of schools, for example, neoclassical school, but also neoliberalism, or in case of Germany here, ordoliberalism. But let's not bother us with that. Let's just conceive that whatever school it is right now, it's this one, it's really homogenic. And we have this mainstream with 91% or 76, depending on the classification system. And this is the conceptual level. And then we see also here, simply on the gender level, of course, there are more aspects to identity, but here it's only gender. And they counted only 13% actually of female economists. And little side note, the heterodox economists, all those who don't do mainstream economics, are marginalized in institutional ways, which I will go into later. So we have this picture on economic research. There are also, I don't have the numbers right now, but there are also studies on the European level which indicate that this structure, this homogenic or monist structure is mirrored internationally, but we have the numbers for Germany here right now. So let's look at economic education. And here we have a similar picture. We have a highly standardized economic education, which is mostly due to the use of textbooks. Those textbooks are, you saw the pictures earlier, those textbooks are internationally distributed in big editions. The main Q textbook was translated in 40 languages and is a bestseller. There's big money in there. In Germany, there are only 4 textbooks used. We have a range of empirical studies on that, which I quoted above. We have only 4 textbooks used, and those textbooks are really similar. This is due to that they all reference one textbook, which was actually one of the first by Paul Samuelson, which is called the gold standard of all economic textbooks. And they take this textbook to that example, and they have a strong similarity. But we also don't have a strong similarity or conformity between those textbooks. We also have a strong conformity between textbooks, curricula, teaching material, and module manuals. It's Modulhandbücher in German. I didn't know how to translate that in English. So we have here a really strong standardization of economic education, not only in Germany, but I would go so far as to say as internationally. And the content of these textbooks, of this teaching material, and we can assume of the economics education as well, is really homogeneous as well. It's focused on the problems of efficiency, assumed in a world, in a context of scarcity, with scarce resources, where you have to use your resources efficiently in order to get the best out of it. Rationality is understood as maximization under constraints. You maybe remember your math classes in 13th grade. It's all evolving around equilibrium problems, and most importantly, it's set in a market-based economy. So the default is capitalism or market-based economy. You have varieties. You have Samuelson speaks of mixed markets, but the default, and this is important, the default notion is a market-based economy. So we have here also this homogeneity in matters of content as well. And in Germany, at least, this trend of monism, of similarity, of homogeneity continues until the postgraduate education. And Roos et al. Published this 2019 survey where you can see that the choice of thesis topics, the methods are very much aligned to those topics taught in economics education. Those topics we had earlier that is considered mainstream in economic research. And this is due to an important fact that is often forgotten because science is not only conceptual, but it's also institutional. There's money in there. You want to have a career, and this all put pressure on the people involved who want to make a career. And for example, teachers, I don't know if any lecturers, economic lecturers are under us here in the group. They know that their career is only advancing due to their publications. They are not advancing due to if they do good teaching, if they do good didactics. Evaluation does matter, but the most important part in advancing in economics is because of the publications, and the publications are also very much aligned with the mainstream standard. So my point, which I want to argue and make tonight, the only point I want to make, that this should not surprise us. This should not come as a surprise to us, whether we like it or not. And what I want to argue and what I want to show you in the following is that standard economics and standard economic education is monistic not by chance, but by design. And now we can decide whether we like it or not, right? So let me get on with my notes here. I let this thesis sink in, hypothesis sink in with you for a moment. I want to ask if that's actually a problem. Of course, we are in the context of a pluralist initiative here. We think that's a problem. I framed it as a problem. I think it's a problem, but we have to be open, and we have to, this at least my opinion, have the analytical tools to each one of you, but also as a group, analyze if that's a problem to us and know on which stage we are talking, on which level we are actually talking. And I hope that our discussion later is not as emotional as the normal, typical discussions on pluralism. But my hypothesis is that it's so emotional often because we don't know on which level we are talking about. And there are so many misunderstandings. So that's what I want to deliver to you today. An orientation where we are at and what we are talking about actually when we're talking about pluralism. So when we talk about pluralism and its absence, we talk about the design of science. Yeah, the design of economics as a science. Mainstream economics has theoretically and institutionally standardized a monist concept of science, but there are many other concepts of science. There are also more than the pluralist one. It's not only pluralist versus monist, there are many others. So this is the level we should talk about when we consider if pluralism is a valuable characteristic of economics or not. So this is the level I want to take you about, and let's open the stage, the curtains for this conversation, which is actually the stage of philosophy of science. I have to do a little intro because I don't know how many of you are knowledgeable in these realms. I can say that myself in my undergraduate economics education, I didn't have an idea about the broad range of philosophy of science. We had Popper and that was it. So let me show you what area I mean we are talking about. Normally, when you think of science, you think of methods, you think of theories, and you think of the research object, the methods you're using to build your theory and research and give some meaningful interpretation of your research object. So the system of science actually is determined on a level which is not often talked about. And this is what I'm calling normative narration. Kuhn, an historian of science, calls it paradigm. I think that is quite familiar to you. Schumpeter, an Austrian economist, calls it the pre-analytic vision. And this is the area, this is the realm where all those acts of science which are following the choice of methods, the choice of theories, the construction, what counts as knowledge and what not, what counts as a relevant research object and not, is deducted from. This builds the premise, the foundation from which, in my opinion, everything is following. And I supplied to you down below some of the questions which are at stake, which are answered in this normative narration. And I introduced this little line to indicate that it is often not reflected in scientific discussions, in the textbooks also. It is not made explicit what the normative narration or narratives that define the standards of economics actually come from, where the conflicts were. So broadly, they're incognito. And this is basically what we are talking about when we're talking about pluralism or monism. This is the area. Why do I call it narration? Because it's often storytelling. It's a step before the scientific pursuit, and oftentimes not under the pressures of logical argumentation, but it's a story. And normative indicates that it's actually object of normative decision. It's a decision made, and this is why I call it normative narration, but there are many other words for it. So I want to now very briefly and very easily show you two stories, the monist story and the pluralist story. So the monist narrative, the monist story actually assumes that there is a universal truth behind the appearances of real world. So you have these images representing the real world and all its complexity on the left-hand side, and those are reduced to the laws of human behavior, at least in economics. And the assumption is that behind the surface of appearances, there is this network of laws, of universal laws of human behavior, which can reduce this complexity, and let's perceive it as an advantage. And actually, by the proponents of this monist narrative, this is set as a benefit in scientific pursuit, because you, of course, there's the land, the map, roadmap metaphor. You cannot depict all the complexity of the world into a map. So a map abstracts from this complexity, and this roadmap is actually provided by this count of laws, and they are actually called laws or core truths or principles. The economic students from you in the group know the 10 principles of economics by Menkyu. So this is what is set to be deducted or behind the complexity of reality. These laws can be discovered. There could be the chance in epistemology. This is also an option that you can say, okay, there are laws, but we cannot discover them. But in economics, there is the assumption that we can discover those truths, those laws, if we only apply the right method. I brought to you a very famous lithograph by Dürer, who represents the scientist as the man on the right-hand side observing the woman. Interestingly, the real world through a certain arrangement of instruments, and we can see that here. And then, experimental behavioral scientist experiment. So this is still relevant today. And since economics often uses the analogy from natural science, this is not so far-fetched. So to be really quick, there is in economics, or is said to be in this normative narrative, that there is a right method we can have. Economists call it the view on the world. And it's really important that this view of the world is structured actually by those principles, by those truths, as Guadney says right here. This economic way of thinking requires incorporating certain guidelines, especially those principles of human behavior I talked to you about. And some of them, some would say the building blocks of basic economic theory, into your own thought process. And by this thought process, by this unique way of viewing the world, you see the world according to those truths. So this leaves us with this concept of science, or this Gestalt of Science, which is often depicted as a tree, a very linear concept that you have to go through this tree representing those principles and what is considered the right method, which simply means applying those principles to the phenomena. And you have to go through this trunk, and beyond this trunk, you can unfold the branches of science. In the empirical study I talked to you about on one of the first slides, the students actually describe this as a tunnel. They have to go through in their graduate and undergraduate study programs a tunnel of micro 1, micro 2, macro 1, macro 2, and math or statistics. You have to go through that, and then you're ready for the diversity of economic thought. This concept is known as normal science by Kuhn. And the only point I want to make to you about this is that it is based on a dogma. Dogma meaning not really, I don't mean it in a bad sense, but that this trunk is the first step of science and the important step of science. It's not about the real world as it is, but it's about a certain set of principles, a certain set of knowledge about the world, which has to be reproduced. And economics education mirrors and serves this reproduction. So we have this trunk, and this and helping students climb this trunk is the task of economic education in this monist narrative. So we see this story. In this story, science is not monist by chance, but by design. And let me just briefly tell you what the consequences of this are, and which is actually one of the criticisms of those telling a different story, is that when you apply those principles onto the world, and we have to take into account that those principles are derived not necessarily from assumptions that are descriptive of the world, but are explicitly, as Milton Friedman says, totally fictional, that we can harm the world, and that we cannot grasp the world in its complexity as it is. It's shaded here in gray. So what we do is we put on glasses, we put on the economics glasses, the shades, the pink shades, and see the world through those glasses, only see those so those principles. And you could think that I'm criticizing here, but this is actually the design. This is what is considered a benefit, and it is when you want to partake in the transformation of world, if you want to do politics and all that. This is the discussion about the performativity of economics, the economization of the real world when you see the world only through those eyes. But we can indulge in that in the discussion. I don't want to take up too much time, and continue to the pluralist narrative. I hope this is all not too quick for you. I guess you're already quite advanced. But if not, let me just tell you that one of the most important differences I conceive between the pluralist and the monist narrative is first that the pluralist narrative says the complexity and plurality of the real world has to be mirrored in the methods and the theories which we employ to interpret and describe them. Of course, they don't have to correspond one-to-one, but they have to grasp the different aspects of it. So you need, such as when you have an object in the middle, you can go to different points and have a different perspective. You can use different senses like smell or taste or view. This is all being metaphoric talk to conceive the complexity of your research object being descriptive, coming from the research object itself, and not saying, okay, we have this set of truths or set of principles, and no matter the reality, we are going to apply it because it works somehow. So this is the main difference, which I wanted to indicate with those two lines, the idea of a correspondence between reality and theory. You can even go one step further and look at those glasses in the middle. And there are also pluralists who say you cannot take down your glasses. You cannot take on a neutral point of view, considering all the and discovering the truth. There are no truths as such. There are already, truth is existent, but truth is always multifaceted, as multifaceted and diverse as the real world, actually. And it depends on which glasses you have on. Of course, you can switch shades. You can develop an art between in putting different shades on. That means different perspectives, different theories, the art of multi-perspectivity, as I will call it later. But these are the differences between the monist and the pluralist narrative. So let me just give you a quick definition of what I think. There are, of course, a plurality of concept of pluralism. But what I conceive as pluralism is pluralism stands for the normative claim that the scientific means for understanding and interpreting reality should correspond to the plurality of that reality, and thus embrace and reflect this multi-perspectivity that you can have. And just to give you another picture, as I talked to you about in the monist narrative, you have an image of science. Here you have actually an image that is often used as a criticism of pluralism, that there are fragmented perspectives and everybody is blind, only seeing the little thing before his or her eyes, and nobody sees the elephant. So what is the pluralist criticism towards that? what if there's no light switch? What if there's no light switch where you can turn on, then there's this one person who can see the whole elephant. But there is the whole elephant, and you can find out about the whole elephant, but there's nobody who can turn on the light switch. There's no neutral point. And then you could say, okay, what if the people in the image could talk? What if they could change positions and distance themselves from their perspective? And this is actually what I mean with the art of multiperspectivity. So you could understand pluralism not only as a system of science, but also what Destin Gallison call an epistemic virtue. It's not only positioning different scientists in different perspectives and then explaining, but also embracing those different perspectives, evaluating this plurality based on different problems, different sets of criteria. And this actually demands what I call an epistemic literacy, a reflectiveness, reflecting your own premises, your own normative narrative, and being transparent about those. So I ran with you through those systems of science. I will not answer. Of course, I have my opinion on that, but I will not answer this for you. You have to decide it for yourself. Maybe you want to develop a whole different system of the science of economics. And the basic problem right now is, how do we decide which normative narrative of science to choose? There are, of course, many arguments, many levels of arguments, the epistemological argument, the pragmatic one, the moral one. And my tip for you just is look at the context you are making the decision in. In which world do you make this decision, and in which position, and what impact can your decision have? And you might want to take a next step and go beyond pluralist economics and go for future and just have a whole different approach. I don't have the time to go into that. So I will come to my last slides and asking, how can we transform and diversify economics if we decide, and I would just presume that right now because of this context and because of my position, that we want to diversify economics, that we think, or I think, pluralism in economics is a valuable system of science which we should adopt. And in order to look what we can do, we should be again aware of what the fields of change, what our context of what we are doing. So earlier on, I only presented to you the discourse side of science. But of course, as we already talked about so much, there's also this institutional side. The performers of science, the speakers, who has the right to speak, who is listened to, who are the sources, and those all are positions of epistemic power. Those who can say who has knowledge, who has not. For example, only maybe you say, oh no, it's only white males who have the right to speak, to be cited in source, or you would say, oh no, it's a whole diversity of people. And these institutions we should take into account when transforming and diversifying economics. And it's actually what I would say the main field of change, which is the most problematic because it puts on this pressure of the self-preserving system. So these all are the levels, the fields you can put this circle into this overview, and just consider them different dimensions of plurality. You have the object, the research object, you have the theory, you have the method, you have the normative narration, and the epistemic power. There are many economists who say, what are you talking about? We are already plural. And this is a really important point also in the debate about pluralism, what to define as plurality, where to look at. And I think it's really important to have in mind that there are dimensions of plurality, and again, know in which context you're talking about it. And so there are many levels of science, and there are many levels to introduce plurality to. So these are also the levels where we can transform science. We can choose different different objects. This is actually done also by the mainstream. I quoted Gary Becker earlier, who sees it as a virtue that economics can be applied to anything that we can actually quantify somehow, and describe it according to those principles I pointed out earlier. So this is broadly called economic imperialism. This imperialist approach, this is quite negative, actually, the word, but you have to know that economists also see it as a benefit. You can also pluralize the theory and the method, and this is actually what we, at least in the economic research, also already see. We see a plurality of theories. I pointed on only two, but there are many of them, and there are also a diversity of methods. And this is actually what is called a plurality of mainstream. And this is the main argument you will hear from economics professors when they say, oh, we are already plural, we have behavioral economics. But then you look a level below and you look at the normative narration, the normative narrative, and then you see the trunk and you see where they all come together. And that's when what I call Robbins' razor, Lionel Robbins, who defined those problems, not the first, but one of the most important. Maybe you know Occam's razor. That's where the trunk is cut. So if you don't, you will not achieve a profound or deep dimension or degree of plurality if you don't allow a variation on this fourth level. You will see that, for example, behavioral economics, which is often said, okay, this is this is pluralism. We have behavioral economics. You will see that they are diverging to the mainstream in those first three aspects, but they are not diverging in the fourth one. So they all also assume rationality, for example, as optimization under constraints and the scarcity problem, etc. So you already see this is the area where I want you to look at when you assess plurality in your classes, for example. And there's, of course, the last level, the institutional level. What if someone doesn't even make it to the study program? If they are not so privileged, for example, if they don't see themselves in economics, and that's what I call the real market entrance. So when somebody tells you we are already plural, I would invite you to go through those levels and see actually where he or she diverges from the mainstream. And of course, we have this selection dynamic here. But we can also use this not as an analytical tool to assess plurality, but we can also use it as a map for change. And this is already going to the end now of my presentation, just to give you some ideas. I know that Merve will also talk about that, but just to give you an idea how to organize or maybe conceptualize those steps to change. And of course, what's normally done and what is some of the core demands of the Network for Pluralist Economics is theoretical and methodological pluralism, which is actually existent already. You had Exploring Economics. They have this wonderful website where you can see all those different schools with different methods and everything. And you can, what you can do is just introduce underrepresented theories, methods. You can see some examples here: feminist theories, ecological complexity, but also introduce underrepresented research objects such as care work, biodiversity, etc. So those are steps everybody can take, every lecturer can take to give you a new article, for example, not to use the textbook, and it's not really difficult to do. Then you have those lower levels, degrees and dimensions of plurality. And this is becoming interesting now. So the core thing, in my point of view, what you should do and what is actually then the system change is setting new standards for economics education and for economics itself, and telling a new narrative. about how this science should go on. So you would have a different concept of rationality, or maybe you don't even center rationality that much. You have a different idea of the world and its problems. So maybe scarcity is not the core problem, and scarcity maybe is a produced entity. So this is a level which requires a lot of conceptual work, but I would invite everybody to be creative on this level and imagine a new system for economics. The last point I want to stress, it's the institutional point. I mentioned that earlier, that this is really, really important. For example, that Möwe implemented this profile and is working together with the faculty on this, because this enhances institutional change, institutional diversity. And here are just some examples. The main example I want to make, or the main point, the tipping point maybe, in my point of view, is to invest in pluralist economic education, because this is where early and young scholars are educated, and this is how they perceive and have impact in the world. Of course, assign power positions to representatives of underrepresented groups in society, and in the discipline, for example, inviting people of color or women to lecture series, create financial incentives. It's about money too, as you have found out also. Maybe introduce a quota, create new institutional structures, not only, for example, such as the Cusanus University, not only change the existing institutions, but offer new positions, new institutes, research institutes, for example. I could go on forever on this. What this is called normative and institutional pluralism. And the last slide, a quick sum up, 5 key takeaways for a system change in economics if you want to change the system. Point 1, key takeaway 1, there's no system change without the conceptual and institutional redesign of economics as assigned, as I mentioned above, with those layers of plurality. Second, which is very important to me, just know the stage the game is played on. Know on which level we are talking about. Are we talking about methods? Are we talking about the trunk? Maybe we just want to have a very different picture of science, and engage in or strengthen your epistemic literacy, your skills to reflect not only your own position, but also the perspective of the other. And I think this really helps communication and maybe prevents conflicts. The other stage is epistemic power. Let me tell you, the discussion of pluralism in economics began in the 1980s. And there are already so many other theories and approaches, and they haven't made it. So this is not only a conceptual issue, pluralism or monism, it's a power issue. It's a question of epistemic power, which is implemented in its institutions. So this is very important to know. That's the stage of the game as well. Third, hold on to your motivations, experiences, and ethics, because oftentimes in economics education, you are told to leave them behind and to embrace new scientific concepts. And this is often associated with personal loss, and it's not a very good experience, and it doesn't carry you a long way. And also this is important because the redesigning of science is actually a normative act. What Möwe is doing right now is a normative act. And so it's really important to hold on to the foundation of your norms. Then fourth, to cite someone really prominent of Leuphana, Maya Göpel, dare the great mind shift. Don't censor yourself and just define new standards of economics education in your own practice, in your reading group, in your initiative. As a lecturer, as a researcher, I invite everybody just to do it not only conceptually, but also materially. Do it yourself, because this can seem like such a big task, but it's not. It's not. You can provide a different reading list. You can provide a summer university. You can introduce an history of economics class. You can do so much as a student, as a professor, as a dean, but also as a politician and a journalist. Who do you ask? Who are the Wirtschaftsweisen? Who do you ask for an interview? So this is what I would close my talk. And of course, this has already been done. Möwe is just one example. We have programs, study programs, which are pluralist by design. For example, here, only the case of Germany. There are many more internationally. In Siegen, Duisburg-Essen, Cusanus, this is already what I mentioned. Exploring economics are great resources, which are based on a different conception of how economics as a science should be done. And the network provides you with many more recommendations of where you can find pluralist programs. And there are, of course, associations such as Möwe, but also scientific research associations who are fighting for that. So we have these we have a wide range of ideas and concepts and publications of what you can do. So there's so much material, you only have to do it.